Hi, this is Alex Levin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Regal, and I'm here with Jeff Nadel from Assure Health. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here, Alex.
So, to start, obviously, I love your business. I mean, maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about you and your business, and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, would love to. So my name's Jeff. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Assure Health. Um, we really started Assure Health back 3 years ago because of something that we had experienced, both my co-founder and I, with our own grandparents. We saw them dealing with multiple chronic conditions, seeing a bunch of different doctors, primary care specialists, and ultimately realizing that they were spending a very little amount of time in the doctor's office. I always say it would be much easier to manage health conditions if the bad stuff happened in those few precious minutes that you're actually in the office with the doctor. But of course, that's not what happens. The scary part, the dangerous part, is often all those gaps in between. And in seeing those gaps, we really identified this goal of pursuing everyday care. It's what we wanted for our grandparents, for our family members, and ultimately what we thought all patients who are dealing with chronic conditions and even beyond that deserve. And so we started with a basic idea, which is if you're managing multiple chronic conditions, it's a good idea to take some numbers on a routine basis, right? Whether that's your blood pressure, your weight, your blood sugar, whatever the case may be for your conditions. And then the natural next question is, who's actually seeing those numbers? There's a lot of patients at home who are, on top of their health. They might be taking their blood pressure. They might even be writing it down in a notebook or a journal. That's not producing, a real tangible benefit for them on a day-to-day basis. And so we really wanted to answer that question and answer it in a way that gave patients a real pathway to everyday care. And so everything we do centers around giving patients connected health devices that they use every day in the home to take those very important numbers. But then importantly, having amazing, friendly, expert, dedicated clinicians on the other end of that, so that every patient has a dedicated nurse who is able to get all of those numbers and ultimately work with them to keep them healthy, stay on top of things, and see around the corner to get ahead of any issues and stay healthy.
Yeah, it's an exciting vision, and so far it seems like it's working very well in the market. So we'll get more into the company, but perhaps to start, let's go back a little bit to where you started. You and your co-founder have known each other since kindergarten, I just heard, which is fabulous. You're not from a traditional tech market. This is not your first time around starting a company. Maybe tell us a little about, where did you get the bug? Why did you decide you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, when I think about the whole journey, it goes back to my first lemonade stands when I was, I don't know how old I was, 5, maybe even younger than that. And it's always interesting when you look in hindsight at these things because I had the bug right away to get out there to sell things, to talk to people, to figure out where there were opportunities in a market. But even beyond that, I had sort of a funny twist to that, in that my lemonade stands kept getting shut down at a young age. So
The
I,
police
I
would
still
come over and
remember.
stop you.
Yeah, I still remember there was a park near where I grew up, a public park, and setting up lemonade stands there, and just routinely having either sort of the park ranger or the police come and say, you need a permit, and shutting me down. And so, on the one hand, you sort of think about that as a funny experience for a little kid, but um, I like to look back and sort of chalk that up as the beginning of my interest in um, participating and innovating in highly regulated industries. That obviously, I don't know. I don't know if you've classified lemonade stands as highly regulated, but
I
but the
wouldn't have,
point being,
but now maybe, yeah, now I should.
right, right. I saw really early on the role that regulation can play in sort of entrepreneurial pursuits and in starting businesses. And while I will admit it was extremely discouraging at first as a 5-year-old or whatever getting shut down, I quickly began to see it as a puzzle and as a real opportunity to actually find places to add value. And so it's that backdrop that really sort of set in motion kind of everything that we've done. As you mentioned, my co-founder Craig and I have started 3 companies together. So we've sort of been in it. He wasn't quite there for the lemonade stand, but shortly thereafter, we started doing some things together in high school and then into college. And so the first company that the first real company, I should say, that we started was kind of born of that same itch where we were in college at the time. We looked at the beer, wine, and spirits industry and saw sort of a stagnancy and a lack of innovation there. Extremely, highly regulated of an industry, and saw that everything that was happening with the on-demand economy and local delivery and that kind of thing just was not touching that space. And again, sort of having that backdrop, started thinking, well, why? Why is everything? Why are we seeing all these things in food delivery and every other space, but not in this space? And sure enough, as we looked more and more into it, a large part of the reason was the regulatory environment and just regulatory challenges that hadn't been solved. And so, we got our hands on that puzzle and didn't let go. Began sort of crafting the regulatory strategy that enabled that business to work, and built that company, scaled it nationwide, and it was acquired back in 2017. And then it's been a journey, ever since then. The transition to healthcare, of course, another highly regulated industry, and so you can sort of see the common thread. But for us, for both Craig and I had these parallel experiences with our grandparents around the same time, and so having that backdrop of kind of where we excel and what we find interesting entrepreneurially with that personal experience in the healthcare space really set us on this path to find all the right people and build a team and tackle this big problem.
And I love that you actually highlight regulated industries. I think too many people shy away from regulated industries. The way I look at it, in fact, it's an advantage, because if you can put together the team and the legal strategy to go and actually solve that regulatory problem, it gives you a huge advantage over other companies in the space and makes it much harder for other people to enter that space. So I actually I'm quite fascinated in general by these highly regulated industries, because it gives you a big advantage in the long run. So you've now done this a few times. If you think back to your time, like, who are the best advisors you've had? Like, who's helped you the most along the way? Like, do you have a family of entrepreneurs, or have you had to go outside and find advisors?
Yeah, great question. I definitely have a family of entrepreneurs, and so this is, there's always that nature versus nurture question here, and I think there's an aspect of DNA, and then there's an aspect of dinner table conversation in this case, and I think I have both. In looking at my history, so my dad, both of my grandfathers, and others in my family too, have always been both a huge inspiration, but also that just incredible sounding board to be able to bounce ideas off of, maybe be told that I'm wrong about something and do it anyway. I'm definitely the personality type that occasionally needs to hit the brick wall myself, and get there. But yeah, it's hard to compare, I think, just those countless dinner table conversations and how helpful that was. And then been fortunate too to have, some early investors who have really ended up being real mentors and helping to see around the corner with various things too. I think another thing that has been interesting in my career and kind of the trajectory there is actually sort of advocates within early customers and early partners also becoming advisors and mentors. I think that, and I'm sure you see this in what you do, when companies are willing to take a relatively early bet on you as a startup, there oftentimes is much more investment there than just a normal, kind of vendor relationship. And a lot of those have ended up yielding long-lasting relationships where, there's a real friendship and sort of a mentorship relationship there as well.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I won't ask you for the worst advice you've gotten. We can keep that for a different day. But what's the best advice you've gotten, like, that you'd pass on? Or another way I sometimes look at it is like, what did I wish I knew 10 years ago as an entrepreneur that I didn't know?
Yeah. So I would break this into two things. One is tactical, and one is sort of more mindset. Someone told me years ago in talking about sort of entrepreneurship, to think about this idea of, the saying, "This too shall pass." Yeah. And that saying is most often used when something bad is happening, right? It's okay, you're in the struggle, you're in the thick of it, but this too shall pass. Um, but I think less often applied, but equally as important, is thinking about it in the context of the highs as much as the lows. One of the things that we certainly experienced, especially with the first company that we started, was just the insane roller coaster of being a founder and entrepreneurship. And I mean, you'll have the lowest low one day and feel like you're on the brink of going out of business, and then the next day sign, the biggest deal ever, and it's a full
Yeah.
celebration. And it's a balancing act, I think, between you want to celebrate the small wins and the big wins and pat yourself on the back. But if you let that volatility go too crazy, the lows can be pretty brutal. So the constant reminder of this too shall pass, I think, from a mindset perspective, has been really valuable. The other thing, and to your exact question, I wish someone had told me this earlier. When we started the first company, we, in hindsight, I realized we didn't reach out to anyone. I mean, we weren't doing sort of just cold outreach, whether that's for clients or advisors, or just trying to get people around the table to help us. It was very much we connected with people by happenstance, or maybe sort of a couple degrees of separation away. But we had a real lack of just sort of aggressively getting out there and reaching out to people and trying to build from that perspective. And I have found, in talking to a lot of especially younger entrepreneurs, first-time founders, that depends on your personality, but sometimes people just need to be told, you have permission to reach out to anyone and to try to get anything, and to try to get time with people. Now, you should do it in a non-spammy way and do it in a value-add way. Otherwise, it won't work. But the biggest shift, I think, from that company beyond, is now looking back at the last, several years of what we've done. At least half of all good things have come from totally cold outreach to people that we're trying to reach out, that were valuable to reach out to. And so I wish someone had just sat me down and said, I'm hereby giving you permission. Reach out to anyone you think would be helpful.
Yeah.
And sometimes that'll work, and it'll be really great.
Yeah, and I think they're great pieces of advice. So if you're willing to share, I'll ask you for examples of a high and a low, so that people can feel with you how terrible it is. But I can give you some examples even from our side. If I think about a couple things. So start with your second point. If I think about, just get after it, to your point, I remember when all these sort of marketplaces started with delivery, and I look at them and I go, oh, that's so fascinating, so interesting. I'm going to go do a ton of research. It wasn't until I started working in startups that I realized the people that were successful in that delivery space, take, alcohol delivery, there were a number of successful businesses, just went and did it. They didn't go and think about it. They didn't go and reflect on it. They said, okay, we're going to go to a store, buy alcohol. We're going to go get customers. We're going to find a lawyer and figure out how to do that. Whatever we have to do to make it work, even if it's not profitable for the first time, they figured out very quickly how to do it. And so I've since very much come to the point of view that, the businesses that are successful are the ones that fail a lot, meaning they iterate a ton very quickly and fail and learn from it and move on. And people think it's odd when I say that, but failure, actually repeated failure, is what's going to get you to success. If you do nothing and you succeed all the time, actually it's going to hold you back. It's an odd thing to think about. And if I think about our highs and lows, I mean, at the business before this, we were in the home services industry. One day we'd have major lawsuits, around the independent contractor model, and we'd wonder whether or not we'd be able to continue to exist. And, the next day we'd go and sign huge contracts with, a Lowe's for, tens of millions of dollars a year. And you're going, oh my God. But, you have to get very good at handling that. And I think this time around, my co-founder and I, are much more level-headed about it. So anyway, if you're willing to share examples, I think it's always helpful for people to see.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, you basically said this, but the quickest way not to fail is to just do nothing, right? I mean, you just sort of sit here and do nothing, and you won't have that experience of failure. But obviously, you're not going to sort of make that forward progress either. And I was smiling as you were explaining kind of how you think about failure, because it is exactly how I think about it, which is the way my brain works. When you say what are the lows, what are those failures, I think about that on the unit of the day, right? There are daily failures every single day, and they're like pinpricks. Eventually you get desensitized in some respect, and they're like pinpricks. And you actually I completely agree with you. You actually want that velocity of failure, because what you really want to focus on is the ratio. And at first you'll have more failures than successes, and then hopefully over time that ratio shifts. But it's very true, and I very much think about it that way. I mean, when I think about when I think about some of those more salient failures, I think it's been times. I think one of the difficult things is that entrepreneurs are basically wired to be perennial optimists. I mean, you have to be a little bit, over optimistic in order to
Yeah.
engage in a pursuit like this, which is kind of crazy to do, otherwise. And so I think some of the more challenging failures have been when we've thought of a strategy, whether it's a go-to-market approach or a particular partnership that you really get excited about, and you see the modeling on it, right? And you sort of you work out in your head like, okay, I can see how this can
Yeah.
work and get really big. And then you're met with crickets, like it just doesn't work. And those things are always tough. And I mean, when we started Assure, we threw a lot of stuff against the wall to see what would stick. I mean, we had an early strategy of working closely with assisted living facilities, more sort of small to medium sized assisted living facilities. That did not work well for a lot of reasons that I can unpack. And we also had more of a strategy early on of being what I think of as sort of pure play direct to consumer, where we were directly marketing to prospective patients. And we realized pretty quickly that for our business and the complexities of sort of the way we deliver care, that wasn't a core competency of ours, right? The core competency of ours and what we really wanted to focus on building was delivering the care and being the very best at that, and then working with partners that ultimately lead to us acquiring patients. And so, some of those moments are tough when you launch a partnership, you're excited about it, and again, the volume just does not come in. But as you said, I mean, that ends up being offset where you sign a partnership, and there's one I can't announce quite yet, but I'm excited to soon that we've signed recently with a large publicly traded company that we had been working on for about a year. And you get that vote of confidence, you get that closed, and you start to see the early indicators of success. And sometimes it's partnerships that maybe you didn't think would yield a ton of volume, and then you're shocked by it, and you have those highs as well. So I think you get it on both sides.
Yeah. So that's a good transition. So you guys have built this fascinating business that takes advantage of virtual care and digital sort of experiences to enhance what people are getting. So I think we were talking before that on average, a typical American is only sitting in the doctor's office, looking at a doctor maybe 10 to 15 minutes a year. So what happens in the rest of the time? And you guys are starting to fill in that gap. So maybe talk about like what were the early channels that worked, like what were the first marketing messages that caught on, like maybe even what didn't work, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing just at a high level that we realized fairly quickly didn't work is anything that's passive, right? So what we found with our business, and I think this is true for a lot of businesses, certainly anything that sort of falls into that high consideration category, but really maybe even in a more pronounced way with healthcare. The brochure that's sitting on the counter somewhere, right, or the poster on the wall are extremely low engagement, low converting things. And early on, we had some pretty large, some companies that have some pretty large and meaningful footprints out in the real world that offered those opportunities to us again that were really exciting ones. And we learned quickly but the hard way that those things really don't convert, and that for us we really had to take a white glove kind of high engagement personalized approach. Our average patient is 73 years old. We're dealing with a population that is managing multiple chronic conditions. This is their health. This is the most important thing for them. And so taking that really white glove, almost concierge-like approach where we get on the phone with prospective patients, right? We make sure we have a really friendly person on the other end of that, and friendly and knowledgeable who can speak to the programs and answer questions, really help to make people feel comfortable. That has been huge for us. A couple discoveries there, to your other question. one thing we've realized is that as much as it is very important for us to communicate directly to prospective patients, it is equally as important to communicate to their caregivers, so their adult children, their loved ones. It's easy to underestimate the stress and strain and anxiety that's experienced by those people, as much and sometimes more so than the patients themselves. They're worried constantly. Is mom taking her medication? Right? How is she doing today? Does her doctor know how she's doing today? And so some of that early messaging on both the patient side and the caregiver side that resonated, this idea of having a second set of eyes, right? That's on that data, going back to where we started, who's seeing those readings, who's seeing those numbers, that extra set of eyes of a trained expert clinician that's seeing that. This idea also of an early warning system, which, if messaged incorrectly can sound a bit scary, but if messaged correctly can actually give folks a lot of peace of mind. What we found is that, a lot of people worry. This is going to sound like an odd formulation, but they worry because they don't know when they actually should worry. So they just worry all the time, basically. And so the ability to give that peace of mind, you have your own nurse on the other end of that. It's a personal relationship with that nurse. She knows your kids' names, your grandkids' names. There's a real relationship of trust. And that person is looking at your data every single day. And when and if there's cause for concern, not only are we going to get out ahead of it and know about it, but we're going to do something about it. We're going to translate that into something that's clinically actionable and coordinate with your doctor. So, that has been really impactful for us as we've really grown and figured this stuff out.
Yeah, so you've hit on a lot of great points. So maybe let's unpack a few. So first, I couldn't agree more about the active. Like when we were when I was running marketing teams in the home improvements industry, it makes me smile when you're talking about putting things up in a nursing home. Like we would literally go building to building. We'd have a wine and cheese event in the building. We'd have a team standing outside, talking to people. We'd do door hangers, we'd do flyers.
Sure.
I think there were two parts of it. One was for sure actually having a conversation, whether it was on the phone or in person, made a big difference. But the other was if we could concentrate our marketing efforts on a smaller geography, on a smaller segment, and hit them 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, they all of a sudden thought we were the default provider in that area. They thought we were more legitimate perhaps than we were at the beginning. Versus, if we took our money and we spread it out across a whole city and each person got one message, they didn't even think about us. So we used to go into major cities and we'd intentionally pick a city block. And in that city block, we would do, from digital ads to physical ads, you target everything if you want. And we'd make sure that group really thought we were the default provider. So 100% on that stuff. And I think, so what you were getting to, a few pieces I think that are interesting. One, you're talking about this very different model of engagement with a customer. So in retail, historically, the identifier for a customer was an email address. And, if somebody gave you an email address, that was the person, and you sent them an email, and that was it. And if they gave you a separate email address, now you had a second customer, and you treated them like a different person. In healthcare, not only do you need to be able to resolve all these different phone number, email, whatever address, all that to one person, but you have multiple people that you need to be talking with because, to your point, there's multiple caregivers. And so it's a very different data model than e-commerce. And I find that as this moves online, a lot of healthcare companies struggle with traditional email marketing, marketing automation tools because they were not built on that data model to have these sort of multiple caregivers, and they're having to innovate there. So I think it's a huge opportunity for companies like us that are, providing, automation and marketing and sales software to make sure that our data model matches the need of high consideration companies, not e-commerce. And then to your point at the end, I think, we were talking about this before, you're starting to get this fascinating situation where you get access to all kinds of information about the customer. So maybe we go there for a sec. If you can say what kinds of information are you guys able to get now about the customer, or what do you try to get, and how do you use that to drive the actions you're taking and the way you engage with customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And just briefly on your point on sort of the data model, I mean, that graph, exactly as you said, it's complicated in healthcare. And by the way, one step further, we have a ton of husband and wife patients because one starts with us and then
Yep.
obviously they sort of cross refer, which is a great endorsement on the part of patients and obviously something that makes us really happy. But you can then start to imagine you're talking about a single household,
Yeah.
two people, some caregivers that are in common, but but maybe some that
And
are
then their
different.
own
Um,
separately. Yeah. Who approves
Different
what?
doctors,
Yeah. Exactly.
powers of attorney, children. I mean, you have to start thinking about blended families and
Yep.
different family members. I mean, you really start to get into the weeds on that. But it's important, and as you pointed out, with healthcare, probably more than anything, you can't mess this stuff up. I mean, you really can't, and so it becomes really important. Yeah, and then to the topic of data, um, you're exactly right. I mean, part of the value that we're able to provide to patients and I think to the healthcare system more broadly is we become a hub for a lot of this healthcare data. And so there is such a problem in healthcare of data being shared and actioned in the appropriate way. And there's a buzzword, and it's been a buzzword for a decade at least, of interoperability. Everyone in healthcare, go to any healthcare conference, they'll talk ad nauseum about interoperability. And I always think it's a prerequisite in some sense, but it's also kind of the wrong thing to focus on. Do we need APIs? Yes. Do we need the interfaces for these systems to communicate? Absolutely, we do. It's hard to do a lot without it, but there's something that you need that's sort of much bigger, which is that we can't even get to that happening in the way that things are currently set up, because you have to reconcile this stuff. You have to make sense of it. You have to make it actionable. The
Yeah.
average doctor does not have time, does not have the bandwidth to be just ingesting rows and rows of data and files of data and then doing something with that. And so where we kind of end up being, and you talk about kind of the journey. In some ways, this was accidental. We really were just maniacally focused on on having the best relationship and providing the best care to the patient.
Yeah.
What that ended up positioning us is in this hub position where we're getting all of the data from their connected health devices, right? So we know the physiologic data. We often know the adherence data, whether they're taking their medications as they should, and then we're able to ingest that health data from their other providers that they go to, relative to their prescriptions and their labs, aggregate it in a way that makes sense, and that's actionable, and then share it as needed with the right providers who are caring for them and treating them. For us, we are, of course, we have kind of two sides to the business. We have our medical practice side, and then the technology side, and so we all of this data coming in is it's very important to us. Obviously, it's all protected by HIPAA. Privacy and security become just an extremely important part of our business, because you have to establish that trust with patients. And so that data is used to deliver care, period. But it ends up supercharging how that care can be delivered, because you have a much, much broader and more comprehensive picture of what's going on with the patient.
Yeah, the stat I was citing before, I think we started, that I find fascinating, is that when you do a diagnostic, so you get the patient to do the diagnostic and something comes back negative, the patient acts on that, as in the patient goes and gets the next appointment, goes and gets the next diagnostic only 50% of the time. So partly, I think it's because we were talking about before, that you don't go to the doctor that often, and that seems to be a barrier. But I think part of it also is just, without a little bit of engagement, without a little bit of somebody actually pushing you, like there's a bit of a you don't want to know, there's a bit of like a I'm not sure I want to know the bad news.
Fear.
And so I
Yeah.
like what you guys, where you do, where you use the real-time information to then use a product like Regal to call them, to text them, to actually have that conversation one-on-one, builds that trust and reduces that fear. So they're not, to the point you were making earlier to me, they're not constantly worried. They're only worried when they should be worried, right? That's the point. They need a little bit of help from somebody who knows the data to disambiguate it for them and help them understand what they need to do next.
Totally, and you hit on an important point, and this obviously relates to Regal as well, is that the data is only as good as it is actionable, right? And so you have to take that, you have to translate it into something that's actionable. That's a core part of what we do. There is another piece of the equation there, and you alluded to this, which is how do you bring meaningful patient engagement into that equation and bring them in the loop as these things transpire. And so, you know, a well-timed text message, a well-timed phone call throughout these processes can be instrumental both at the outset in actually capturing the engagement, getting patients enrolled in programs that otherwise might feel you know, like a heavier lift, but then certainly also as the care is actually delivered, how do you reach out to the patients and the prospective patients early in the process at the exact right time to maximize the potential of their engagement and the actionability? And it's hugely important to us. And to take it one step further, and where the Regal product has been really helpful is how do you try to eliminate some of the mental burden on the people actually doing that outreach to the patients and the prospective patients? Because when you're responsible for this, it can be a lot to, okay, who's my next best call now? Who do I reach out to? Versus using some of that supporting technology to help answer that question and set up those points of engagement.
Yeah, and I think underpinning all this is sort of an important assumption that you and I make that I think a lot of people are new to, which is the goal is not to automate all of this. The goal is
That's
to
right.
keep the human in the loop. So, you know,
Yes.
ultimately we want that nurse or that doctor who is uniquely qualified to have that conversation on the phone. What we can use technology for, to your point, is to help identify when you should be reaching somebody, with what message, what's the next most important action. Save that human the time, you know, and give them superpowers that they couldn't have had without it, because you're now operating at enormous scale online with a lot more data. So use technology to enhance the human rather than to replace them. In e-commerce, it feels like largely the trend has been, you know, don't talk to your customer, eliminate all human interactions. It's not seen as cost, and, you know, get rid of it. But I think it's actually very positive that in these more considered industries like healthcare, you know, we see businesses actually investing in service because they know that's the differentiator and something that isn't going to be replaced today.
I mean, you took the words out of my mouth in terms of when I explain our approach kind of in this area, which is exactly that our business is a people intensive business, right? I mean, I sort of joke all the time with our nurses that they are the product, but it's really not a joke. You know, that relationship that they have and how they deliver the care, that's the thing that we're selling and providing it, you know, throughout our business. And so when you think about the bet, I always like to think about companies too in terms of like, what's the bet that you're making? Like if you had to distill down one thing that if you're wrong about it, you're out of business essentially. And I think people can be afraid of sort of saying that, especially to investors and that kind of thing. I think it's a very important thing to say because you want that alignment on, you know, what the future looks like. Like, do you agree with this or not? If not, then we're not aligned in how we're thinking about this. And I always say the bet we're making is that the expert friendly human clinician will never be outmoded. They can get more efficient over time. They can get enabled and empowered by technology, and we're betting on that too. But part of our bet here is that as technology continues to get wild and crazy, and we have all sorts of things that we can't even imagine today that provide increasing and sort of less invasive, less burdensome visibility into how patients are doing on a daily basis, that there will always be a role at the top of that system for that human clinician to say, how do we take all of this and now do what's best for the patient? And again, I think technology will continue to make them more efficient. And also some of the feedback we've heard, technology will continue to make their jobs more rewarding because they actually get to focus on the direct patient care elements of it, and not some of the more kind of administrative taxing elements. And that's the bet for us that you know, we are in the business of giving these clinicians superpowers, whether it's our nurses, you know, who are directly on our team who are interfacing with patients, or whether it's the primary care providers and the specialists that are kind of external to us, but with whom we collaborate in a very intimate way on a daily basis. We've got to give them superpowers to sort of get to this next level of being able to deliver personalized care.
Yeah, and I think even so, we've been talking a lot about engagement. I think even of other examples, like a friend of mine runs a company called Elaborate that is helping doctors do a better job of understanding the diagnostics to come back, the tests to come back, helping explain that to patients. And one of the things that my friend has learned from working with doctors is they love that there's now another system that's looking at the same exact data and helping make sure they see everything correctly. Because otherwise, yeah, there's so much data now, it's hard for them to like really make sure that they checked every single level and they didn't understand every interaction. They want to explain it to the patient. They like sitting down with the patient and explaining because it's important. But having that system is enormously helpful to them because it's something that a human could never do as well as a machine in that case. And so they've been very successful in that angle. Well, happy to like talk about your business forever, but maybe we have a lot of sort of early stage entrepreneurs sort of who listen to this stuff. Maybe let's talk about funding a little bit. So you guys publicly have announced some funding. The last round you've announced was from strategic investors, which is unusual. Maybe talk about that decision of going and raising money from strategics instead of raising money from friends and family or from venture capital investors and what that means for you guys.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things where we had the good fortune of pretty early on in the history of Assure Health getting connected to some real kind of industry veterans who have been there, done that. They've seen where the pitfalls are. They have a lot of great relationships. And our approach to healthcare as we came into the industry was very much one of saying, we know from what we've done in the past, what skills are translatable here. And we talked about that, a little bit earlier. But we also know that we needed to approach this industry with a healthy dose of humility. Healthcare is complex. It is high stakes. And I think if you come into this industry with sort of that hubris, there are countless stories in healthcare of that going really, really wrong. And so we tried to take a deliberate approach not to do that. And part of that was really making sure that we surrounded ourselves with those people who I mentioned. And so had the good fortune of getting connected to a few of those early on and started seeing that, there was a real opportunity to pull together kind of an expanded group of those folks, both individuals and companies and so forth, and using that as a real launch pad to help us shortcut a lot of not only the learning, but also the path to distribution, especially when it comes to selling to some of these larger healthcare companies and really institutions. It can be extremely helpful, I think, to have that assistance in navigating those processes and going in with some extra comfort there. And so we did make that decision to kind of put together those that initial round with strategics, and it's really yielded for us. To date, a lot of our opportunities to date have come from that initial group of investors. Now we will be layering on, some more institutional participation, but we're also layering on more and more strategic. So for us, I mean, we've seen the value there, and then we want to continue to build. One thing I would say, especially to first-time founders and sort of early entrepreneurs is everyone will tell you their value add, right? And I'm sure you see it all the time. So that doesn't necessarily make it strategic. I think you really need to get to know these people and evaluate what are you trying to achieve in the context of your business? Where are you trying to go directionally? And then who does it make sense to have around the table? And that's not to say it's wrong to just take capital as capital. That is completely valid. But if you're looking for that strategic participation, kind of do your homework there.
Yeah, it's a great explanation of the value. So just while we close out here, I always like giving people the opportunity to predict a little bit, and we'll come back in 5 years and see if you're right. But I guess where do you think the healthcare industry is going? Like, what do you think are the next couple big changes coming up over the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, I think there's two big things. Look, there's a ton of things happening, but in my world and where my brain spends its time, right? I think there's two big things, and done right, they're interrelated. Done wrong, they're not, and that'll make sense in a moment. So one is just the overall transition from fee-for-service healthcare to value-based care. The 2-second snapshot on what that means is moving from a system in which providers are paid based on the units of service they provide to a system where there is a real alignment of incentives and providers are financially incentivized to keep you as healthy as possible. And there's a lot more nuance, and I could spend an hour talking about it, but that transition continues to happen, and it continues to happen, I think, at an accelerating pace in the Medicare age population. It's something that we are very excited about because what it does when done right is it separates the wheat from the chaff. You can't, if you're not delivering on health outcomes to patients, you won't survive for long in a value-based environment. On the flip side of that, if you are delivering for patients, if you're really moving the needle on outcomes, you have the opportunity to have a much more successful business because you can capture more upside relative to where you would hit a ceiling in a fee-for-service environment. So that's happening, and I think it's accelerating. At the same time, as we talked a little bit about earlier on, the volume and velocity of data that's being generated from patients at home is accelerating massively. I mean, we are moving from a place of having just single purpose devices, think a blood pressure cuff or a weight scale, to increasingly passive continuous monitoring, often with wearables. And the sheer quantity of data and the breadth of that data, the comprehensiveness of that data, when you really start to think about it, is incredible. And I think it will only get more and more so. I have friends who are wearing an Apple Watch and an Oura Ring, and they're stepping on the scale, and they're doing labs. And so the real test of everything is going to be, of the healthcare system is going to be, can you ingest that data and make it actionable and useful? And that's obviously where we play a lot. But where these two trends come together and where I see the future of things heading is, if you can do the right thing with that data, you can have a tremendous effect in a value-based care context. And put in the most simplest terms, can you take that data, can you do a bunch of things to it, and then can you ultimately deliver better health outcomes at lower costs? And our belief is, if you can do that, it's a huge result. And so my bet is going to be dramatically increasing volume and breadth of data, and an increasing ability to do the right things with that data in tandem with the healthcare system moving to value-based at an ever-increasing rate.
Great. Well, Jeff, thank you for joining me. This was fantastic.
Yeah.
If people want to learn more about Assure Health, where should they go, or how should they reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love anyone to check out our website. It's myassurehealth.com. And obviously any family members or anything who can benefit from what we do, we're always happy to help. It's been a pleasure talking through this, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.